Hello and welcome to a tutorial about Colourwork, and in particular stranded Colourwork from Imagine Landscapes. I'm Sarah Shira and you probably know me from my gnome designs. Gnomes are an absolutely great first project for Colourwork because they are stress-free. A gnome has to fit no one. So as you're doing this, if your tension's a little weird, if this is a good learning piece because it doesn't need to fit somebody, if it's a little wonky, well, wonkiness is gnominess. Stranded Colourwork allows us to introduce multiple colors per row and to basically sketch or doodle on top of our fabric. And what you can't see here is what's going on behind. And the reason it's called stranded is because strands of yarn are carried along behind in the back. Those are also called floats. We're going to cover with the two main sticking points for stranded Colourwork. First of all, how do you deal with having more than one strand of yarn? And second of all, how do we deal with the difference in tension that a lot of people struggle with? So let's talk about dealing with the yarn. Depending on whether you knit holding the yarn in your left hand or in your right hand, your options are actually going to be very similar. I'm going to demonstrate things partly on double pointed needles and partly on the magic loop technique today. And I'm going to demonstrate things a little bit for people with the left hand yarn and people with the right hand yarn. So one option you have for Colourwork knitting is to literally ignore the fact that you have more than one color stitch by stitch. So if you are a person who likes to hold your yarn in your right hand, you can pick up the yarn and knit the stitches in your right hand. I'm going to knit 3 in color 1. Then I'm going to drop them and I'm going to pick up the next color. And I'm going to knit 3 stitches in the next color. Same is true for knitting holding the yarn in your left hand. You can drop the yarn. Make sure you pick up the right color. Knit, 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 drop the color, pick up the next one, and keep on going. Dropping the yarn is a totally acceptable way, and most of us begin in that way. Another option is to hold both yarns in one hand and to go and grab the yarn that you need. So I'm going to knit 3 in this color, for instance. Continental knitters would knit like that, and if you are an English knitter or a thrower, holding 2 in your hands is something I am far less practiced with for this one, so it's going to look much less elegant, but you just need to get the yarn up and over the needle tip. And usually the first one is the hardest because the other yarn wants to be sort of front and center, and usually once you've done the first one in the color, it's a little easier to keep on working. There are also little tools that you can buy, like little rings that will hold 2 yarns. You would place it over your finger and then it actually has a little loop and that holds the yarns and carries those. I don't have those, so I can't demonstrate them today, but that is an option if you really want to hold the yarns in just one hand. Now the last option you have is to knit with both hands, and most people who develop or who get into Colourwork sort of in a more serious manner over time just eventually migrate to this technique. What you might need to do it is to cast on some stitches and just knit for a while with your less dominant technique or your completely new technique. But you would hold each color in one hand, however it is you strand or however you hold your yarn, and everybody holds their yarn a little differently. And then you would simply knit with one color, with one method, and then when it's time to switch, you just switch which hand is doing this. And at first this will feel really awkward and really almost like being in kindergarten, and you have to stick your tongue out of your mouth and trying to figure out how to write a B and how to write a D, and it's really tricky. But you will get better with it with time, and I have somehow made a stitch here or has that come from somewhere? I'm just going to drop that. Let's get rid of that. That's just a loop hanging out on my needle there. So as you can see, there's a lot of variability in how people handle the yarn part of this. And that's just something that you are going to develop with time. There is no wrong way to hold the yarn when you strand. There is no wrong way to knit. As long as you end up with a fabric you are happy with and you are able to do what you want, then you are knitting the right way for you. So don't be surprised if the first few times you try stranded color work, it feels awkward, because of course it does. You're new to this. But on the other hand, being new to something and feeling awkward doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It's a great feeling to tackle new things. So just as you work, your yarns are going to kind of get twirled around each other, and one way that can help manage that is to have them kind of set off at different angles, so that as it's happening, it becomes a little easier for you to figure out which way you need to twist or untwist to kind of manage that. When we are knitting color work, we obviously want certain parts of the design to pop more than other parts. This here is a checkerboard and it's fairly balanced, so it might not matter so much if one color kind of fades a little bit to the back. But a lot of times with color work, we have sort of a main color, and then we have a color that's doing the interesting things. And we want that color to be the one that really pops. Certain ways of holding your yarn can lead one color to pop forward a little bit more. And in general, people find that the one that they carry that comes from underneath is the one that pops a little bit more, so that if one yarn is always coming up and over the other, when it is you're sort of changing from one color to another, that yarn, because it's going under, is traveling just an ever so tiny bit farther to get to the next stitch, which means that yarn will always have just a little tiny bit more yarn, or that color will always have just a little bit tiny more yarn, and so each stitch will be just ever so slightly plumper. And so those slightly plumper stitches kind of push the other color into a slightly smaller space. So if you are knitting color work and you're wondering why the thing that you want to pop out isn't popping, do a little research about color work. What I have read, and that generally seems to work for me, is that use the color, if you're doing it with two hands, the easiest way to do it is the color you want to pop goes in your left. And sorry, I'm knitting that wrong again. What that does is it's always coming from underneath a little bit. So see, if I go from my right hand with this, let's get that on the stitch right, or the needle right. If I come from the top, you can see how I'm sort of traveling over the yarn in my left hand. Whereas when I come from my left here, again, I'm traveling under this yarn. And so the left is always going to have just that little bit more. To further complicate stranded color work is the fact that tension is something we have to keep in mind all the time. If you are used to knitting, you are used to sort of just knitting away, and you get to the next stitch, you put your needle in, you grab the yarn, you make a loop, and you move on. But stranded color work requires us to stop and add a new step to the act of making a stitch, and that is to pay attention to how it is tensioned. Because if we move from stitch to stitch in the same color all the time, our yarn is always right next to where we need it to be, no matter how you hold your yarn. It's always just the next yarn. It's really simple. But if that yarn needs to come across that whole set of stitches and travel to be here, it is really easy for us to say, pull too tight. And if we pull too tight across these stitches, well, they're going to be really short. And what can happen is a section of your color work can kind of puff up if the strand behind isn't the same length as the number of stitches it needs to travel. So what I mean by this is that when we knit, 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 we're safe. But as soon as we switch colors, this yarn has to travel the distance that these stitches want to take to be the right tension, to be the right gauge. So when you put your needle in the very first stitch of a color, the temptation might be to knit too tightly. And then we've got a bunchy section. And even if your tension is right, all the other places, this part of the fabric will be snugger, will be tighter, and will probably change how flat your knitting is. So every time you switch colors, you need to sort of remember to ask yourself, am I crowding the stitches I've already made in the other color? So when you put your needle in, one thing it can be nice to do is to just kind of stretch the stitches out on the right needle, because if they're stretched out, that yarn has to travel sort of the right distance. So what I will often do is sort of stretch them back and then pinch this, so that when I go to make that stitch, I'm not tightening it. And I keep pinching it till I've made the second stitch in that color and kind of locked it in. And every now and then as I go along, I will stop and just kind of like pull and see, is this fabric the right amount of loose? You want knitted fabric to have give. A stranded colorwork section will always have less give than a plain stockinette section, but you still want it to have some give and to some play. And you want to ask like yourself, is this section of stranded colorwork the same tension as the stuff below it? So you're going to need to be thinking about your floats, as these are called, because the yarn that we're not using is sort of floating along behind as a second layer. There is a danger always with knitting in the round about tensioning across corners. It's particularly in the magic or in the, and this problem is particularly problematic for DPN users, because we have a triangle of knitting and the shortest distance across a triangle is a straight line. But that's not the distance that the float will have to travel once we're wearing it. Once we're wearing it, it of course would have to go all the way up behind these stitches and then all the way behind these stitches. And so if you are tensioning across a float or across a needle division or a corner, my tip for you is to put your needle in the first stitch, and then I use one of my free fingers to force the yarn to travel up along those stitches and around whatever corner is happening. And then I would knit two, and then again I go and I make sure that I'm testing that corner. When we do color work in the round, the floats are traveling around inside a circle. And that is creating a smaller circle inside our fabric circle. So the floats are doing this behind the fabric circle we are creating, which is making a smaller circle. So these floats just kind of want to be smaller. The second circle wants to be a little tinier. And that of course can create problems with our tension and getting the fabric the way we want. Now, if you're knitting a gnome, obviously this is slightly less important than knitting a sweater or a mitten, but the outside of a circle is of course a bigger circle. So what if we could make our floats travel that bigger circle? Well, we can. On DPNs, of course, the inside of our circle is the inside of a triangle, but nevertheless, the fabric is a circle. Now, this is a technique called knitting inside out, which sounds incredibly complicated, frightening, and frankly beyond the average knitter. But I'm telling you, if you can knit inside out. You simply take your fabric and you push it inside out. Now you're looking at this and you're saying to me, Sarah, this is a mess. There's no way I can keep track of what I'm supposed to be doing. Now I'm purling. But no, that's not how this works. You are still knitting and you are still going to see the front of your fabric. Because of course, if you look at this part, that's the reverse side of your fabric. But what about over here? So the trick for this is to look at the inside of your work and to work on that side and that junction of the needle. So you would have the yarn in your hands, and when you flip it, you may be going, but I don't want to knit in the wrong direction. Well, the key when you're knitting in the round is to remember the yarn is always going to be coming off the stitches you last worked, so you don't work these stitches a second time. You always go and pick the next ones in the circle. Now normally we're knitting clockwise, And we always go from this tip to this tip, and that's clockwise. But now we're going to be going counterclockwise and yet still making the exact same circle. So the yarn is coming off here, so the yarn has to be going to there. So let's knit 3. So now I am knitting inside out. The fabric is inside out, but I am still knitting, and I am still looking at the fabric, and I can still see the stitches that I should be working on. So 3 pink go on top of 3 green. I'm good. Let's pick up the green. All right, let's now knit 3 green to go on top of 3 pink. I'm still knitting. I can still see the fabric in front of me, and the floats are traveling that bigger circle around the outside of the fabric. This is absolutely my favorite discovery for knitting color work in the round, is how simple this is. And then when I get to the end of the color work section, I will just flip it back and work the same way I was before. So these floats are traveling just that little bit farther, and it's just a magnificent invention. Thank you to whoever thought of that. So floats are traveling. We're still doing color work. When I would be done, I would just flip it inside out. I would check which needle had the yarn coming from it. That's the needle I just worked. So this is the next needle, and I would just proceed from there. If you are knitting on magic loop or 2 circulars, or using the crazy flips or the flyers, of course, you don't have a triangle that's making a circle. You've got 2 parallel lines that are making a circle, but you can still knit inside out. So you would turn the fabric inside out as before. Then you look where the yarn is coming off of. And so you would also be knitting on the inside of the back half of your circle. So you would push this set of stitches to be the working stitches, and you would pull this needle to be the working needle. If you're doing magic loop, if you're doing 2 circulars, obviously you would just be pulling the front needle instead. All right, so then we need to get our yarn in our hands, and we would follow our pattern. So this round would be knit 1 of each color, just switching every other color, and that puts that little pop of color in the center of our square here. So as you can see, I'm still knitting. I'm still using the magic loop technique or whatever technique, but for the FlexiFlips or Addy Crazies, I think they're also called, or 2 circulars, magic loop, all of these techniques, you are still going to be having the same way you're holding the needles, the same everything. It's just going to be happening at the back half of the work rather than the front half. Even with all these techniques and making sure your floats are the right tension and all of this, some people still find that no matter what they do, their color work tension is tighter than their stockinette tension on the same needles. And there is a little something about stranded color work that makes the stitches squarer than the stitches in stockinette. So stockinette stitches are slightly wider in that V than they are tall, which is why stitch gauge is always different than row gauge. And so if you are someone who, no matter what, always finds that this part of your knitting would be a little smaller than the stockinette around it, a lot of people will simply go up a needle size for the colorwork portion. So you would knit in the gauge needle for the stockinette, and then you would switch. And if it is something like a sweater or mittens or something where it's really important for it to fit, you would probably want to swatch that so that you could make sure that in your swatch you are getting the same approximate gauge here and here so that it fits. And then, of course, we have blocking. Now, colorwork is one of the techniques where blocking makes an absolutely fundamental difference in how tidy this looks. So if you are looking at your colorwork thinking, this is terrible, I am not good at this, I'm promising you, part of it is that you haven't blocked it yet. So I've worked really hard at this. I've kind of stretched it and I've popped it, and that helps too, because that's almost like a dry blocking. But just like cables or lace, colorwork settles into itself when you get it wet. Now, when you block color work, it's not like blocking a lace shawl. You are not getting it wet and then stretching it out and trying to pop open those lace holes. No, that's not what you're doing. You're getting it wet, you're kind of popping it down, and you're kind of patting it, and what you're just doing is letting those stitches relax into themselves. You're letting the stitches in the top of the fabric relax into themselves, and then you're letting the stitches and the floats in the back relax into themselves. And most people find that, you know, the second or third time they block something, it looks better and better. A lot of times those really old sweaters where it looks like, oh my goodness, knitters in the olden times had the most astonishing tension. It's partly just the fact that we've washed and let it kind of settle into itself for decades. So don't neglect to block things. Don't judge yourself before you block. One last thing I want to mention is that most color work is presented as a chart and not written directions, and so you will be needing to learn to read charts. And so I am going to be linking to another video I filmed about how to read charts, because once you unlock chart knitting, things get a lot easier. It's like having a map to the knitting universe that you are about to create, and I'd like to help you with that. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you have questions, drop them down below. I love to make things easier and clearer for knitters. Happy knitting!